And welcome back to an episode of the Cool Your Jets podcast. We're your hosts, Ben Blessington and Michael Nania, back with another positional breakdown. Last week we handled the running backs. This week we're going to switch to the defensive side of the football, go towards the linebackers. Michael, how you doing, man?
I'm doing really good, and this is going to be a fun position to break down. It's one that has a lot of question marks, but at the same time, a lot of potential as well, and a really good coaching staff to back up the development of these guys. So it's a very intriguing position, but a scary one at the same time.
Yeah, they're question marks, but they're potentially optimistic answers. You know, there's a lot of hope on this side of the football in this position group. And I would say that no position is greater impacted by the switch from the 3-4 to the 4-3 than the linebacker unit. I mean, I really think they're going to benefit the most from the Robert Saleh change, especially like you mentioned, a head coach in Saleh who made his bones in the league as the linebackers coach, and a great defensive unit, and the return of a 4-time Pro Bowler and an all-pro linebacker in CJ Mosley. So a lot to talk about here. So let's just kind of go through the main 5 guys, and then we can talk a little bit about the people who are going to round out the roster, and then we'll answer some questions about the unit as a whole. But let's look at CJ Mosley first, who, as I just mentioned, 4-time Pro Bowler, all-pro linebacker. I mean, one of the best linebackers in football 2 years ago, and played probably the best 3/4 of football I've ever seen from a Jets linebacker. Gets injured week 1, comes back week 7, I think it was, against the Patriots, barely plays, wasn't healthy clearly, and the injury spread to his core. So is essentially out the entire year of 2019, takes last year off with COVID. And now he's back, and I don't really know what to expect from him, but the buzz around him at OTAs and minicamp has me pretty optimistic about his return. How do you feel, Michael?
Yeah, I feel pretty optimistic as well. I feel like he's a guy who I'm not too worried about a 2-year hiatus with him because I feel like his game isn't necessarily built around athleticism. He's not a guy who is winning based off of speed, based off of quickness, things like that. He's a guy who has always made his impact based off of his smarts, his IQ, his preparation, and also his leadership, just getting everyone lined up in the right place and helping to overall just run the show the way it should be run and getting those coverage busts to a minimum. They very rarely happened in that Ravens defense over the 5 years in which he started almost every single game for them and played almost every single snap. And that obviously all starts with the middle linebacker who is pointing everyone in the right direction. So those are the things he does well. And I feel like missing 2 years, especially last year, which wasn't due to injury, shouldn't affect him too much. And he's not old. He's still only 29. So I feel like he should be in a very good spot to come back and still be at the peak level he was over his first few seasons. He looks, by all counts, has been fresh out there in practices so far. It seems like he is really enthused to be back. It does also seem like that Adam Gase might have played a little bit of a role in him opting out last season. But all signs look pretty positive right now, and I think he's the type of player who is built to come back from a 2-year gap like this effectively.
Yeah, we'll circle back to Mosley a little bit more, but I like kind of what you said about how his success has never been predicated solely on his athleticism. He's kind of like a pocket passer. I don't want to use, this is a bit of hyperbole, but how Tom Brady is still playing and he's 44 years old. And the reason
Right.
is because he's always won because of what's up top. It's never been because of his fastball or his athleticism. Those mobile quarterbacks, those quarterbacks with huge arms, once they reach 34, once they reach 35, and the physical traits start to wear off, the performance goes down. And linebacker, obviously, is an incredibly athletic position. You mentioned he's 29. He's still in the prime of his career, but around 30, 31, that's when linebackers typically fall off. But hey, he still has a few years left in him. But like you said, he might be able to ride off a little later because his career has always been predicated on what's up top, his football IQ, his play recognition, and that might lend him to be Robert Saleh's right-hand man, another coach in the field. I'm really excited to see him. Like you said, I really hope he stays healthy. But the vibe around him this spring is that he's moving well, that there doesn't seem to be too many remaining issues from that groin core injury. I mean, I'd hope so, because in retrospect, maybe the extra year off helped him. There's the con is that it'll be a little rusty, but the pro is that he should be fresh. I mean, he should be fresher than he's ever felt. We heard the same things about Le'Veon Bell, and he was never
Right,
quite the
right. That
same.
was the
So,
comparison I was going to make. This is what is it's kind of reminding me of, but I feel like linebacker a little bit more than running back
right.
kind of
It's more,
you can lean
especially
towards that mental
because
side.
Especially since running back is so predicated on another position group, the offensive line,
Yeah,
especially a guy like
right.
Le'Veon Bell. CJ Mosley's success was never really predicated on those around him. He was a key cog in Baltimore's defense, and a lot of people were worried when he left Baltimore how they would fare. Obviously, they were still good, but people don't forget those 3 quarters we saw CJ Mosley in New York were amazing. I mean, those 3 quarters alone paid for about half that contract. He's got to earn the other half with his play this year and probably next year as well. It doesn't look like they're just going to get out of their contract unless they want to eat a big sum. Part of the negative, I guess, at the time of him opting out last year was that the Jets are going to be on the hook for that huge $18-19 million a year contract for another year before the out after. At this point, it'll be after 2022. But hey, if he's playing great and he's, like you said, he's 29, he'll be 30 next year, still in the prime of his career, and the Jets are having success, nobody's going to be complaining about that. Now, Jarrad Davis, who is going to be the strong side linebacker, the Sam linebacker for this unit, is a bit of an interesting signing. He was the first Jets signing of the free agent period. I know you weren't the biggest fan of Jarrad, and we've gone back and forth on Jarrad versus Jarrad. I've heard more people say Jarrad, so we're going to stick with Jarrad
Yeah, let's
Davis
just
for
go
now.
with that. I'm going to go with Jarrad.
We're going to go with Jarrad Davis for now, but I'm fully open to Jarrad if we want to switch it. His strengths seem to come to really complement what it takes to be a strong side linebacker in this defense. He's a great blitzer. He's more of a thumper, run stopper. He's had some issues in the past manning that Mike role in Detroit and having to play more pass coverage. But how do you feel like he fits in this Robert Saleh defense?
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where he fits in because what worked for him last season is that the Lions reduced his role. He was starting the first 3 seasons, didn't work well for him. He's consistently leading the league in missed tackles. And then last year, he plays only about 34% of their snaps on average, rotating in, playing some Mike, some strong side, some Sam for them. In that rotational role, and that worked really well for him. He put up the best numbers of his career in coverage in terms of well, he actually still missed a lot of tackles, but in coverage he was better. His run defense was better in that role, so that's where I would want to project him in this defense, rotating in because that's what the Falcons and Niners did last season. They had 2 every down guys, and they had a third guy who'd rotate in for about a third of the snaps in their 4-3 defenses. For the 49ers, their starters were Greenlaw and Fred Warner, and Azeez Al-Shaair would rotate in for that third role. And then for Atlanta, their starters were Deion Jones and Foyesade Oluokun, and their third guy is Michael Walker. He would play that role. So I think based on what Davis did last season, that's what I would like to see him do. Play about a third of the snaps because it served him well last year. But you look at the contract he got for 1 year, $5 million in guarantees, and you compare that to guys like Jayon Brown, Nicholas Morrow, who were starters last year and got less than he did. That sort of suggests that the Jets might want to play him in that every down role next to Mosley, and have whoever wins that other role. In terms of the young guys, Nasirildeen, Sherwood, Cashman, who we'll get to, play that guy in the rotational role. So it'll be interesting to see whether they want Davis to stay in that limited role that worked well for him last season, or if they do truly see him as an every down starter, because I'd be skeptical of that just because of his track record. But it will be interesting to see.
I definitely think, I mean, if you're just going to go off the OTA's minicamp starters, he's definitely going to be in an every down role, and he's going to be in that strong side. I think I agree with you. I think there's plenty of reason to be skeptical about him. I think he had more issues as a Mike linebacker, and I think he's a better fit in this defense than Matt Patricia's hybrid 3-4-4-3 defense. Um, I mean, he was their first signing right out of the gate. So clearly this was a Robert Saleh guy. And I think you made an important distinction comparing him against Atlanta linebackers, because it's a mistake I make often, and I think other Jets fans do too. While this is Robert Saleh's defense, it's Jeff Ulbrich. I mean, he's the defensive coordinator. He's going to be calling the plays, and he's going to have his influence, just like Michael Flores, not just going to run Kyle Shanahan's offense. He's going to put his own spin on it. So while it's the base defense of Robert Saleh and what he did in San Francisco, Atlanta is a great team to look at when you want to see what they want to do. And like you mentioned, Jayon Brown and Nicholas Morrow, who are probably more weak linebackers, which is more the pass coverage linebacker of the 2 outside linebackers. Clearly, I mean, the Jets targeted that with rookies and on day 3, like you mentioned. I think it's a clear sign that they look towards Jarrad Davis as that starting strong side linebacker, because you look at the rest of the linebackers, not just the guys they drafted, not just Blake Cashman, not just the guys who rounded out the roster. Nobody else is really a thumper like Davis is. A lot of these guys are converted safeties, athletic, um, pass coverage type linebackers. I think they were intrigued by his blitzing potential. I think the other thing is that Robert Saleh plays that base 4-3 defense, or I guess Jeff Ulbrich as well. This defense plays its base 4-3 more than any other defense in the league. I mean, at the end of the day, nickel will still dominate, but you're going to see plenty of sets out there with three linebackers. We'll see how they curve that if Sherwood, Nasirildeen, or Cashman are struggling. But I do think you're going to see Davis out there in an expanded role. It probably won't be out there on third downs, I would say. And that strong linebacker, I think he'll be the one that you take off to put in your slot, whether it's Michael Carter II or whatever. We'll cover the corners in a later episode. But moving ahead with Blake Cashman, who him and the next two guys we're going to mention are all in a competition right now for that weak side linebacker. And I guess Cashman in some ways is the incumbent. I guess you could say that he's the longest tenured linebacker on this team. Actually, Mosley beats him by a month. Second longest tenured linebacker on this team. Yet I feel like we've never really seen him. And I mean, at this point, he's pretty much like the SpongeBob meme with the guy who's in the full body cast and was born with glass bones and paper skin. I mean, because he's just always in the rehab area. I mean, he's just never healthy. And he was a guy that we talked about a lot last offseason as maybe he's a guy who can take the leap. A lot of people liked him in the draft community coming out, was a team captain, fell a little bit in the draft, liked his measurables. From a physical standpoint, he always looks good, always looks in tremendous shape. But yeah, he's just never been able to stay healthy. So it's hard to put together a scouting report. But Michael, I guess what do you like about Cashman's game and what concerns you about what he brings to the Jets?
There was a lot that overall I think Cashman struggled because we did see him quite a bit in 2019. He started
That's
5
true.
games, and he played most of the Bills game, a lot of the Bills game in the opening game of the season. But he did show a lot of versatility. There were a lot of different things he showed capability in. He played some outside linebacker, rushed off the edge. He played a little bit of everything when he's off the ball, strong side, Mike, weak side. He got some man coverage roles against tight ends, so they put him in a lot of different spots, and in most of them, he showed you something to like, something to build off of. But for the most part, the production wasn't there. But he was a 5th round rookie, and it's too much to expect out of any guy. I think he had a rookie season that's kind of like Ashton Davis's this year. Overall, the production wasn't amazing, just like Davis this year. Got roasted against Kansas City, gave up a touchdown to Gesicki. And overall didn't have amazing production, but he took on a lot of different roles, and there were a lot of reps for Ashton Davis where you saw, okay, I see the talent, I see the athleticism, I see what this guy could become, and he also showed us that he can do a lot of different things, which makes him a valuable depth piece, rotational piece to have. I think Cashman was similar, in a linebacker role more so than safety, but he did a lot of different things, and I could definitely see that will role being the spot for him, especially maybe rotating in on third downs if they need a guy to play that role, because he definitely leaned towards the passing game, I think, in terms of his strengths. Run game, I think he really struggled. He got washed out on a lot of blocks at the second level, didn't create a ton of penetration, had some gap filling mistakes, but in coverage, he did have some pretty good man reps against tight ends. He did a great job covering the flat, just attacking downhill, making tackles in space. So I think in that weak side linebacker role, he could be a very good fit playing, that role I was talking about with Davis, because I think based on, it is fair to say, like you said, based off what we see in camp and the contract, Davis is going to be starting. I think he's going to be playing most of the snaps next to Mosley, and the other linebackers will be the ones competing to rotate in and out, like the role that Davis played in Detroit last year, like those other guys I mentioned in Saleh and Ulbrich's defense. I think that will be what Cashman, Nasirildeen, and Sherwood will be competing for. So I think that's a role that makes a lot of sense for Cashman. I actually am pretty intrigued to see him in this defense. I think a 4-3 is a much better fit for him than the 3-4 the Jets are playing, because in the middle of a defense where he has a lot of very important run defending responsibilities straight in the A gaps, that's not his skill set. He had made a lot of mistakes, especially the Jacksonville game that year. Um, Leonard Fournette had a huge run that Cashman was pretty much primary culprit for. That's not a skill set, but put him outside, get him some reps in the slot against tight ends, put him an outside linebacker on the edge. I'm actually pretty intrigued by his fit in this scheme, so I'm excited to see what he does.
Yeah, it's interesting that the fact that the Jets drafted two converted safeties, presumably to be in that weak linebacker role, where Cashman was more of a thumper in college. Obviously, he brings athletic profile, so he's not your everyday 1970s middle linebacker. If CJ Mosley were to go down, God forbid, let's hope that doesn't happen. But if he gets injured, who do you think steps up in that Mike linebacker role? At least right now, I think a lot of questions will get answered in training camp, whoever performs, whatever. But in Robert Saleh's, plan right now, let's say he loses Mosley week 1 again, knock on wood, that doesn't happen. Who do you think slides in to replace him? Do you think they would move Davis over from a strong side role, playing with Mike like he did a bit in Detroit? Do you think you put right now Cashman, who's done that his career, or maybe another guy that we'll talk about next?
Well, I think, like you said, in terms of their targeting Davis, getting him early to fill that thumper role, he is the biggest guy in this group at 245 pounds. I think it would be him, but I do think that does kind of point to a question mark with this unit. I think they do kind of lack depth in terms of, having another guy who you could comfortably have in that mic role. And look, you're not going to find a backup who you're going to be legitimately comfortable with in, essentially the quarterback of the defense role. But Davis would be the guy, I think, for sure, just because beyond him, I don't think there are too many viable candidates other
Right.
than Cashman. But it would be tough. I think this is why Mosley's such a hugely important player for them this year, because that's going to be a huge drop off if you have Jarrad Davis. That's
There
what
we
we're
go.
going to go with. If you have him
Want to be
playing Mike
consistent.
linebacker, yeah, we got to establish that consistency. Jarrad is what we're going with. If we hear Jarrad officially, we got to ask him. Someone has to ask him.
Hey, maybe we get him on
That's
the
what we
show.
got to do. Maybe we'll get him on the show, but yeah, I think that will be a big drop off
It's
because
probably the biggest drop off in the team, right? Because
right,
corners is weak depth, but there's not really. They're all kind of in the same boat where it's like the Jets
yeah,
currently have a bona fide starter, but outside of that, I mean, it's a steep
exactly.
steep curve.
It's one, and it's not even just the talent. It's also just the leadership perspective and how important it is to have a good leader, a guy who could get everyone lined up in the right spot at that position.
Yeah,
That a lot of other spots, that aspect of it doesn't really matter. But
yeah.
here,
It's
and it's not that Davis can't do that. It's just that there are 3 years of him starting on tape in Detroit where he was a starting Mike middle linebacker and he really struggled. And
right.
then last season, it was when they moved him around a little bit and used his athleticism and just took some of those responsibilities off his plate when he started to really shine. And I think the Jets will be doing a lot of that this season, even if he'll be playing more snaps. I think that's what they'll be focusing on. But I do think Davis will be that guy. If Mosley goes down, he'll kick inside. Cashman will probably start next to him in the other every down spot. But that's going to be a big drop off. So the depth in this position is a question mark until hopefully at least one of these guys proves that they can really be relied upon.
Yeah, I think like you said, Davis when he had the green dot in the back of his helmet in Detroit, kind of really struggled, and you kind of alluded to this, but I would say that in this defense, that Mike linebacker spot is probably the most important spot for this Robert Saleh defense. They value the defensive line as a whole. It's probably the most important unit. But if you're only going to get one player, look at what Fred Warner did in San Francisco. Look what Deion Jones did in Atlanta. Having that Mike linebacker for this unit, like you said, to lead on the field, off the field as well, line everybody up, and just fulfill a really important key cog. I mean, you're just at the center of the defense, center of the middle level. So obviously, it's a huge boost for the Jets if CJ Mosley can be anywhere close to the player he was last year. If he goes out, I think you're right. I think they have three conceivable options, and we'll look at the depth shot, the depth at the bottom of the position group, a bunch of unproven, undrafted guys. So I don't think you can really bring any of their names up right now. But there's three options right now that I think Robert Saleh would look at. I think Davis, like you said, is the most likely because he started in Detroit and did it. It was a different scheme, so maybe if he gets his confidence up here as a strong side linebacker and mostly goes down a little later in the season, and Davis is having a good season, I think maybe he can make that transition back. He's a veteran too. He's the second oldest player in the team or in this position group outside of Mosley. So I think you're right. I think he would probably be the guy. But I think Davis's skill set really suits him to be that strong side linebacker. And while the Mike position has a lot of depth issues, I would say there's not really another strong side linebacker on this team. I mean, a natural strong side linebacker. Like you said, I mean, I guess Cashman could bump out there. There's some other guys that you could bump out there. But Sherwood and Nasirildeen are both weak side linebackers. Delshon Phillips is a weak side linebacker. Brendan White is a weak side linebacker. So there's not really another strong side linebacker. So there's an argument to be made, especially if Davis is doing well. Okay, leave him there. Cashman is maybe second in command there because he's been a middle linebacker his whole career. But the guy I'm thinking is the long-term backup of middle linebacker, maybe Mosley's replacement in 2 years, and the guy that, depending on how he plays, could be the guy who could do it as soon as this year if Mosley were to go down. And it's the guy I want to talk about next. That's Jamieien Sherwood. Because quick shout out to the Jets for their Flight 2021, is that what it's called? Right?
Yep.
The documentary series. I've watched 2 of them, so I've only watched half. We'll talk about that maybe on Monday's episode. Great in-depth look at the team. If you haven't checked it out, do. This is, I mean, free plug for the team that you'll follow. But like the best inside look at the team since Hard Knocks. But when you listen to why they liked Jamieien Sherwood, and you can get this mostly from Robert Saleh's press conferences as well, it was his knowledge and his ability to communicate and just the level of maturity he had when he'd watch film, his mental recall. It sounded like a lot of the things that the reasons they picked him is because they love his potential at that Mike role. Obviously, he brings a level of physicality. He comes down from safety, so he has that athleticism. But it really sounds like, because he was a guy that got picked and a lot of people are like, who? Especially when Hamsah was still on the board because the Jets picked Sherwood first. It sounds like the Jets really loved what Sherwood brought in the film room. And I think he's a guy to keep an eye out for as maybe Mosley's replacement. But for right now, he's definitely in that competition for the weak side linebacker spot. Michael, what do you think he brings to the field?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think he's definitely probably the next in line to be a future middle linebacker. Obviously, you would like to see a little bit of bulking up preferred, only 220-pound frame, which you could kick up a little bit. But he does have a lot of experience, or showed in college, a lot of experience pre-snap, getting guys aligned. A lot of the stuff that goes into being the green sticker, the green sticker on the helmet guy with the headset, that you need to have in the NFL. Those communication skills, understanding the defense. He showed a lot of that, and even though his frame is kind of small, he does have really good length, so that's going to serve him well also as he transitions to this position. So I think Sherwood is a guy who could, project really well to this role. And his athleticism also isn't great. That's one of his weaknesses. He doesn't necessarily have special tools in that area. So that's another thing that could, pull him away from safety, away from weak linebacker, and more towards that Mike linebacker role. So I think you bring up a really good point that he is a guy who, this could be the role that they're projecting for Sherwood more so than competing for that weak linebacker role. I think that they wanted to take advantage of his smarts, his intelligence, and his experience. He did just straight up line up at linebacker a lot of the time at Auburn. So I think those are the things that they're going to try to build off of with Sherwood and try to project him into that backup Mike role to start out. Whereas it's more so going to be the next guy we'll talk about, Nasirildeen and Cashman, competing for those will reps.
Yeah, and Jeff Ulbrich, just because I was looking up Jamieien Sherwood for my next point, has already called him a quick study. But I just wanted to look at Sherwood just to remind myself real quick, because he said he has a small frame, which I just want to make a small correction. I think his weight definitely needs to go up, but he definitely doesn't have a small frame. I think there's room for growth in that frame. You mentioned his length.
Like the
right,
length
exactly.
And height is there.
Right, exactly. I think this is a frame that you could really build on because, yeah, when you look at him, he is physically imposing. Even if he doesn't weigh that much, part of that's the length, but he has broad shoulders. He definitely has room to add some weight and be that middle linebacker. But like we've alluded to, I think he was definitely picked mainly for what he's going to bring in the film room and his potential to be a Mike linebacker in this defense. And then rounding out the top 5 that we're going to take a more in-depth look at before we hop into some questions about the unit as a whole, Hamsah Nasirildeen, who in my mind, if I was a betting man, I think I'm going to bet that he'll be the ultimate starter, day one starter at weak linebacker, even though he was picked after Sherwood and Cashman's the veteran. Michael, maybe give your preview and your take on Hamsah and what he brings to the field. Has a lot of hype behind him. A lot of people are excited about him because although he went later in the draft, him slipping, not dissimilar to Bryce Hall, kind of seemed more due to an injury, and it seems like the Jets may have gotten a bit of a diamond in the rough.
Yeah, I think Hamza is definitely, in terms of overall upside, I think he offers more than Sherwood does. A little bit more versatility in terms of the coverage roles he can handle. His production was better in college. He's a great tackler in coverage. He consistently graded really well, and I think his stock was going to be a lot higher if he didn't miss most of this past season. So there's a lot to like about him, and I think, like we said, Sherwood, probably you're more so looking for the mental tools, the leadership, things like that, for him to be that middle of the defense guy. But I think with Nasirildeen, I think you're getting more tools, upside. He's the guy who you could see in that will role, getting some rotational snaps, competing for Cashman with that for that role. And that's where you could potentially see a lot more splashy tools in terms of acceleration, looseness, potential blitzing ability, explosion, things like that. And he also has really good length. Another guy who, like Sherwood, isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily have the weight to play linebacker yet. As a smaller linebacker, he definitely has enough. So probably at 215, if he can get up to 220, that's fine. If he's going to be a weak linebacker, but he has great length. He's 6'3", 82-inch wingspan, 34-inch arms.
Jesus.
So these two guys got a lot of length. That's a
Yeah.
consistent between them two, which again helps them really well transitioning to linebacker. You could putting on a few pounds is doable, but no one's gonna extend their arms. That's not possible. But these guys already have that length, so all they got to do is bulk up a little bit, and they have very broad frames, like you mentioned. So I think Nasirildeen is more so where you're looking for athletic upside and versatility, and Sherwood is more of the mental, sturdy, consistent kind of game.
I think Sherwood of the two will ultimately be bigger. Part of that's just the positions they're going to ultimately play.
Right.
I do believe Sherwood's probably going to be more of the Mike, where Nasruddin would be the weak side linebacker. Although I think they'll both play that role this year. I mean, when I think that Hamsah is going to win that day one starting job, I still think you're going to see Sherwood out there in that role, and I still think you're going to see a bit of Cashman. And although Cashman's the veteran, we haven't really seen that much of him. Like you said, 5 games in 2019. He started the opener this year, but so he's really 6 starts ahead of Hamsah and Jamieien. So we haven't really seen too much of him. And he missed all of OTAs and minicamp. So I don't think there's too much of a difference, I guess, in veteran versus rookie here. They're kind of all in a similar starting position, the way I view it. I think Hamsah is a guy, like you said, the upside is just so tremendous. And if we're to listen to what Robert Saleh said about the cornerbacks and the advice he got from Pete Carroll about, look, play the young guys. They're hell on wheels. They're going to make a lot of mistakes. But if you invest in them and you believe in your coaching staff, especially towards by the end of the season or as we get into next year and the year after that, you're going to really build a good foundation. Some of these guys are really going to stick and they're going to benefit from these reps. And I think Hamsah is a guy who's going to make a ton of mistakes his rookie year. I think, especially at the start, he's going to make some mental mistakes. I think you're going to see some fun, athletic, flashy plays, maybe a pick six or something like that. You're going to see that athleticism really pop. And I think he's going to be a guy that you're going to see really improve throughout the season. I hope he can have maybe a slightly more effective season than like Jarrad Davis, like you mentioned earlier. But I wouldn't expect for him to light the world on fire, even if I think he's going to start. Certainly, there's been a few training camp highlights where he's been on the bad end of it, I guess. I think you're going to see rotation here, but Nasirildeen really excites me for this role. And I think the potential to be a starting weak linebacker in this league for a long time is certainly there. But although there's a competition in training camp, whoever finishes third place, I still think will hit the field in that position a good amount this year. And then rounding out the roster at linebacker, 4 guys: Del'Shawn Phillips, Brandon White, Noah Dawkins, and Camilo Eifler. There we go. Del'Shawn barely played any defensive snaps, more of a special teamer. Brandon White was a college safety from Ohio State, so you'd have to figure another special teamer, probably more of the weak side linebacker. We'll see exactly what their plan is for them. And then Noah Dawkins, he has a little bit more flexibility. He was a former defensive lineman, so he certainly has a pass rushing ability. So you'd think strong linebacker, but then he also played safety. I mean, he played all over the place, and his athleticism is there, but he's a bit undersized. So probably another special teamer, and then Camilo Eifler, who's Eifler. There we go. undrafted free agent. He's a guy that I think you could see at Mike, strong linebacker, special teams. Came from Illinois. So those 4 guys, I think, are going to battle to round out the roster. But the 5 guys we mentioned and really went in depth are the guys that you're going to see on the field the most. I think out of those 4, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I think Sean Phillips is probably the most likely out of the 4 that you can bet a roster spot on. The other 3 guys are going to have to really battle to impress. So let's hop into some questions, then we'll get out of here. I guess for our listeners at home, Michael, the biggest difference in the Jets switching from a 3-4 to a 4-3, can you just explain what that means for these players schematically and kind of the roles for each, weak Sam, Mike, and how it kind of differs maybe from a defense that the Jets have run forever in a 3-4?
Yeah, for me, I think the biggest difference comes really in versatility. And you could just look at the Jets defense the past few years as a comparison. Like, for example, the past few years, you would have pretty much 2 every down guys at inside linebacker who never come off the field. And then your other 2 linebackers are pretty much playing a completely different position on the edge. For example, last year, you'd have Neville Hewitt and Harvey Lange, I guess, for the majority of the season. Avery Williamson was out there for a little bit before he got traded. Blake Cashman actually was going to be the starter at the beginning of the season, but he quickly got hurt and then couldn't get the role back. But you'd have 2 guys in the middle who essentially aren't playing a role that's too much different for the most part. You'd have generally strong side and weak side designations. Like Hewitt would usually be the strong side guy because he's not necessarily as great in coverage, so you want him to be on the strong side of a run play, taking on the tight ends, whereas other guys covering more ground. And then the guys on the outside are basically edge players playing completely different roles. But in a 4-3, I think it's a lot more important to have guys who can cover ground in space because you have fewer players on the defensive line, and you have fewer players in coverage because in 3-4 defense, it's just you have more speed out there in a 3-4 defense. You have 2 defensive tackles, then you have the 2 outside linebackers on the edge, and in a 4-3, you only have you have 4 down linemen, and then it's the 3 linebackers. So I think it's important to have versatility there, guys who can play different roles, like Davis, for example. Even though he's struggled in a lot of his roles, last year he was playing all 3 different roles for Detroit. He was playing some Mike, some Sam, some Will, mostly Mike and Sam. But he showed he could play all 3, and I think that's important to have in a scheme like this. But I think for the most part, you still have one guy who's playing a role similar to what you would see from 3-4 linebacker, which in this case will probably be Mosley. And then opposite them, you have a couple guys who are a little more interchangeable in terms of you're going to have in this defense, your Sam, probably like we've been talking about, will be Davis, who will be manning up against tight ends, blitzing pretty frequently, and staying on that strong side, setting the edge against the run. And then you have a weak linebacker who will be covering more ground in coverage, taking on deeper zone assignments, and mostly playing on the side of the field where he'll have more ground to cover, where his athleticism can come into play. And that's probably where you'll be looking for those young linebackers to be competing. So I think the biggest differences just come in interchangeability and the need for more athleticism, considering you have more down linemen on the field. So less speed out there, so a little more pressure on the linebackers to be able to cover space and less pressure in terms of run defense. And I think the Jets did build to that pretty well. Like we talked about, they don't have really a second true thumper or a third after Davis and Mosley, but they have plenty of speed from top to bottom in this linebacker group, and I think that fits the scheme really well.
Yeah, I think there's definitely versatility in the positions themselves, but as far as the defense goes, I think you get a little bit less so in the sense that in a 3-4, I think there's a bit more blitzing opportunities for the linebackers. In the 4-3, especially the Saleh Ulbrich defense, for the most part, you're going to get 4 down linemen rushing the quarterback, and the 3 linebackers are going to drop off. Obviously, you can rush your linebackers. I think you're going to see Jarrad Davis do that plenty. But in a 3-4, the way I look at outside linebackers in a 3-4 is their primary responsibility is rushing the passer, and then they can drop in coverage, and that supplements what they do in the field. But in a 4-3, their primary responsibility for the outside linebackers is going to be to play coverage, and rushing the quarterback is going to supplement it. So I think, kind of like you said, there's more versatility between the linebackers, because you'd hope, like kind of going back to the question we were talking about earlier, that let's say you're starting Mike Strong and weak, just for the example, is CJ at Mike, Jarrad Davis at Strong, and we'll just say Blake Cashman for Strong, or for weak, excuse me, that if Mosley were to go down, you could probably sub Davis in, and you could probably sub Cashman in. So you get a little bit more flexibility from that standpoint. I guess when you look at Mosley and how he fits in a 4-3, do you have any concerns about the transition? Although it's fairly similar, there are some mild differences, and I guess he did a little bit of it in Baltimore. And look, the Jets have run 4-3 packages, especially under Greg Williams. He was more of a hybrid type of guy, but he ran a lot of 3-4, mainly nickel. But there were a few 4-3 packages, so it's not a completely foreign concept to a Jets fan. But the Jets haven't run a 4-3 since, John Abraham. Like a long time ago. Since we've been watching, for the most part, when you go through at least the last decade and a little bit more, they've been all 3-4. So I guess CJ Mosley making that adjustment from a 3-4 to a 4-3.
I actually think he'll do okay with it, because I think the point you made is a really important one. I think there is a lot more blitzing from your inside linebackers in a 3-4, because when you're playing 3-4, you have your two edge rushers, which in last year's case was Jenkins and Basham, are more athletic than the guys you would typically have on the edge in a 4-3. Like, for example, now it's going to be Carl Lawson and Vinny Curry. And those two guys are not guys you necessarily want dropping to coverage. Lawson has done it a little bit in his career, but he's actually been pretty bad at it when he has. But he's done it very infrequently, because it's not something you want him to do. Whereas Jenkins and Basham are a little bit smaller, and a little bit, not necessarily smaller, but those two guys have a lot more experience and have been a lot more successful dropping into coverage than guys like Lawson have, who typically played their hands in the dirt. And that's why they're 3-4 outside linebackers, because they can drop into coverage occasionally. And what that allows you to do is drop those guys back and have the inside linebackers fill in for them as blitzers. And that's why Neville Hewitt and Lange were both among the leaders in blitzes among inside linebackers last year. But in a 4-3 defense, where you can't really trust your edge defenders to drop as much, and you can much more so trust them to rush the passer. That's the point of signing a guy like Carl Lawson, is the fact that the whole game you could just send him after the quarterback with no questions asked, and he's going to make things happen. Quentin Williams, Franklin Myers, Rankins, Curry, they're just going to create pressure on their own because they can do it. And you don't necessarily need the linebackers to blitz as much. And it's also harder to do it because, like I already mentioned, it's harder. You can't trust Carl Lawson, Vinny Curry, if Franklin Myers plays the edge, if Ronald Blair plays the edge. You can't trust those guys to drop back as much, so it's harder to blitz. And the point here with Mosley is that blitzing is probably the weakest part of his game. It's not something he's great at. He's never been too effective of a blitzer. He doesn't have much finesse to his blitz game. He kind of will just charge straight downhill. Sometimes his power will make something happen, but he doesn't really have a swim or a sidestep or anything to his blitzing game. So he's never done a ton of damage there. So I think the fact that he'll be blitzing less and covering more is going to serve him pretty well. And I think he can have a very good chance of having a Deion Jones or Fred Warner type of production in coverage in this defense because of that. So I actually think this serves him pretty well.
Yeah, I think I agree with you to an extent. I think that the 4-3 will put him in coverage more, like you were saying. And I think that while it's never really, I wouldn't call it a deficiency of his, because he's not necessarily the most athletic of guys, especially coming off 2 years away from the game. That is a bit of a concern, because he's going to have to be relied to cover the middle of the field a little bit more than when he has a partner in crime right next to him. But the best part of it is a 4-3 inside linebacker is the complete quarterback of that defense, even more so than when he used it as a 3-4 inside linebacker. So I think he's going to really benefit from that role, or at least Saleh's defense and Ulbrich's defense is really going to benefit from having a guy like Mosley, a veteran like Mosley, calling their defense, getting people lined up, calling audibles. I think I'm a little concerned to see how that hip, or excuse me, that groin and that core injury holds up. in the middle of the field, considering he's going to have to be moving a little bit more. But like you said, I mean, what he brings on the mental side of things kind of balances out any sort of athletic deficiencies you might have in coverage. I would never label Mosley an amazing coverage linebacker, but I would say that he's an adequate coverage linebacker. What he really brings is more on the mental side of things, and so that makes him a better coverage linebacker. I guess when you look at Jarrad Davis, can you, I guess, in your eyes, why do you think that Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich were so attached to Davis for this role in this defense? I guess, what does he bring in your eyes that made him the first free agent for the Jets to sign?
I think it's just confidence in his talent, his pedigree, and their own track records of developing talent at linebacker. Both these guys have taken non first round picks and made them into star linebackers. Warner, Jones, those two guys are stars, but they've also taken Aluakon and Greenlaw and turned them into starters as non first round picks. So both, and also Salah was a part of Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright in Seattle. So both these guys have done great work with linebackers. So I feel like they're very confident in what they can do at the position. And they see a guy like Davis, who is a former first round pick, is still in his prime, showed some improvement last year, has great athletic, not just athletic ability, but just total physical package in terms of strength, movement skills, everything. I think they just see a guy who's still very moldable at this point of his career, and they're confident in what they've done with linebackers, and they see a guy who they can turn into something great at this point of his career. So I think that's really what it comes down to, just banking on upside, banking on their own abilities to develop talent at this position.
Yeah, clearly a physical specimen. There's a reason he was a first round pick. And not only was he the first free agent the Jets signed, I would argue that he's probably the only free agent that, at least in your eyes and probably my eyes as well, was overpaid, especially when you look at the rest of the linebacker market. Joe Douglas, not necessarily known as a general manager who overpays. He's generally in the underpaying, great deal type of side or side of things. And Davis's contract was, by most people's accounts, an overpay. So it signals that the Jets really liked him. Ian Rappaport even reported at the time that there were many teams interested in Davis's service. So clearly, going back to when he was coming out in the draft, a lot of people really like him. I think many people felt like he was misused in Matt Patricia's defense. I think he's going to be a lot better in this base 4-3 defense, playing on the outside. You're going to be able to benefit from what he brings athletically, especially as a blitzer. And like you said, he's with one of the best coaching staffs when it comes to developing linebackers, and having Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh right there, if not the best two coaches to be around. So I'm excited to watch how he develops. When you look at the will role, I kind of alluded to who I thought might win it. Who do you think ultimately wins the starting will spot, and how do you see them divvying up the reps? Do you agree with me that you think it's going to be a rotation, or do you think Saleh is going to try to have one guy in there and get him as many reps as possible?
I think it will end up being a rotation for the most part, because I think between Nasirildeen and Cashman and even Sherwood, who will probably dip his toes into it a little bit, I think there are a lot of different things that those three guys offer. So I think the beauty in that is that you can really play around with it. You could change things up based on the opponent and what you feel like is best for stopping that opponent in the given week. And I think that's great for the development of these guys too, because they won't have too much pressure on them to come in and handle big snaps and be forced to take on an important role right away. They can be put into spots that are favorable for their skill sets and not be put into too many uncomfortable positions. And I think it helps the team as well to have guys who can do different things. But I think the pseudo winner will I'm gonna go with Nasruldeen, just because of the Douglas connection, because he didn't draft Blake Cashman. I think that's something that's
Right.
important to keep in mind. But I do like Cashman in the scheme. Health is going to be important for Cashman. He still hasn't been healthy so far, so that's going to be really important. Um, so I'm going to go with Nasruldeen as the guy who gets the most snaps out of players other than Mosley and Davis at this position. But I do think, like you said, this will be a group that everyone gets a little bit of playing time. It's not necessarily going to be, here's your winner, the other two guys are backups. I think we're going to see a little bit of everyone, not just because of injuries, but even when everyone is healthy, I think we'll see a good
Yeah.
mix of snaps.
Yeah, especially with the coverage responsibilities that Saleh and Ulbrich are going to task their linebackers. Going to have to be traveling all over the field. So I think it'll be good to get some fresh linebackers or some fresh legs out there. And it is important to note that while Nasirildeen might be in our eyes the better fit for this weak linebacker side, and we're maybe more excited than Jamieien Sherwood. At least when Nasirildeen was picked, I was really excited about the pick, and Sherwood was like, "Oh, okay." I trust Joe Douglas, but I didn't really know too much about him. PJ Clark came on our show and shouted out Hamsah Nasirildeen as one of his favorite players. So I think, as you get to day 3 in the draft, it's pretty much, do I recognize this player's name? And if so, I'll clap. And if not, I'll still just support the GM at this point. But it is important to note that the Jets had the choice between Nasirildeen and Sherwood and took Sherwood. There's no debate about it that if they had to choose one, they would go with Sherwood. And so maybe that's more long-term projection. They really liked what they saw. Maybe Saleh saw a future Fred Warner. I think while ultimately I think Sherwood will be a Mike linebacker in this league, and that's my own personal opinion, but it's based off what I've been reading from Saleh and Ulbrich. Still think he can play weak linebacker. And if he's the guy that you value more, you want to get him reps, especially if you listen to Robert Saleh. So his best chance to get reps, if Mosley and Davis are both healthy, is to get Sherwood out there at weak linebacker. So I think you're going to see plenty of him. I think you're right. I agree with you. I think Nasirildeen will, as far as who's going to show up in the CBS graphic week 1 as the starter, I think it'll probably be Nasirildeen, but I think you're going to see him rotate a ton, get a bunch of reps on special teams as well, really just get their feet wet. Because ultimately, I think that they're really focused on developing both these guys. But if they had to choose one, it seems like it'd be Sherwood. Who do you think out of the 4 guys I listed earlier, Del'Shawn Phillips, Brendan White, Noah Dawkins, and Kamilo Eifler, who do you think rounds out this roster? So I guess how many linebackers do you think they ultimately keep? And outside of the 5 we've gone in depth on, and which players do you think they carry? Just as we head into training camp, I know you don't know too much about these guys, but just your gut feeling going into training camp.
I think Phillips is probably the guy.
I hear typing in the background, so you're frantically looking somebody up.
I'm looking at his contract,
Okay.
so I just want to get the exact numbers. Don't think I'm just reading off his Wikipedia page.
Who is Noah Dawkins?
Who is Noah Dawkins? What teams he play for? But I think Phillips, just because of the Falcons connection, is probably the favorite. But
you think they keep 6?
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to next. I feel like it might just be the 5 because I think they're going to go a little bit heavier at safety and cornerback because I think obviously there are 3 safeties who are locks with May, Joyner, and Ashton Davis, but I feel like Sherrod Niesman's going to make the roster. At cornerback, you could go a little bit deeper, especially at nickel with Javelin Guidry, Michael Carter II. So I feel like in that secondary, they could go a little bit deeper. Also at safety / cornerback, Bennett Jackson is a pretty good special teamer, was an important special teamer last year. He could make the roster. So I feel like there are going to be some defensive positions where they go a little bit deeper and they might be able to afford going a little bit lighter linebacker. So I don't know. I could see just the big 5 at linebacker, but if they are going to keep another one, I would lean towards Phillips because of the Atlanta connection.
Yeah, I disagree with you on how many linebackers are going to take, because when you look at the injury history from Mosley, Cashman, and Nasirildeen,
right,
especially Cashman, can you really count that those 5 are going to be on the roster for 17 weeks, 18 weeks, 17 games? I like that the NFL has continued their IR rules from last year with the COVID season. So the Jets will get some roster flexibility from practice squad and IR. So I think, I agree. I think Del'Shawn Phillips will stick on the team as a special teamer primarily, but also as a depth piece. I think Brendan White, I think, has the best chance to stick, but I think you'll see at least 1 or 2 linebackers on the practice squad. So I think on the active roster, you're going to see 6, the 5 we talked about, plus Del'Shawn Phillips. And then I think you could see Brendan White, Noah Dawkins, and Kamilo Eifler, 1 to 2 of those guys, just depending on how they play in preseason, on the practice squad at least. But hell, maybe if Brendan White or one of those guys really performs well, I wouldn't be surprised to see them keep 7. Part of the reason being, Jamieien Sherwood and Hamsah Nasirildeen both have safety experience. So while they're NFL linebackers, I think they could maybe go a little lighter on safety, kind of opposing what you're saying. I know you like Bennett Jackson on special teams, but I think the Jets have plenty of guys they brought in that can, under Brant Boyer, overtake that, take that role from him. And if you go lighter on safety, a safety goes down, you're not too worried about playing Hamsah Nasirildeen at strong safety, are you? You're not too worried about playing Jamieien Sherwood there, even if they're slightly out of position because they did it in college. So I think they're going to go at least 6 deep, but maybe even 7 if the guys really perform well in preseason.
Yeah, those are really fair points. It'll be interesting to see. I think we just have to see some of these beyond the top 5, the rest of this group in the preseason to really get an idea of what they offer, because we've seen very little of these guys. But between Dawkins and Phillips, who actually have been in the league,
Right.
they both played in the 2019 preseason, a little bit of regular season, but there's not a lot with them. And obviously, the other guys are undrafted free agents, so we have to see these guys in the preseason, and I think they'll go based off of that.
I think one of either Brendan White or Kamilo Eifler, this is just a gut feeling, one of them is going to impress in preseason. One of them is just going to be the random Jets preseason training camp stuff where it's like, oh, do you try to make room for him? Then you cut him at the 53-day cut down, and all the fans are like, oh, God, I hope he sticks the roster. And, obviously he makes the practice squad because all other 31 other teams don't know who they are, don't care about them. So I feel like Brendan White or Kamilo Eifler is going to have a good preseason. Just looking at them briefly before this episode, I like what they brought. I like what they bring as undrafted free agents. Last question, and then we'll get out of here. Your expectations for the unit. How do you feel like this unit stacks up compared to the other linebacker units across the NFL? I mean, granted, it's a hard unit to grade because every position is a question mark. Is CJ Mosley still the same player? How is Jarrad Davis in the scheme? Who's going to start at weak linebacker? And if whoever it is, we've barely seen any of them. How do you feel like this unit stacks up compared to the NFL? And what are your expectations for how they perform under Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich in 2021?
Well, I think it all starts with CJ Mosley, because if he is in peak form, I think he can be a top 10 linebacker. And if he can do that, then I think it's all going to grow off of that, because having a player like him in the middle of the unit should be really beneficial for the rest of these guys as they try to come right in as, whether it be rookies or in the case of Cashman, a very inexperienced player, as they try to come in and make an impact in a really tough spot. I think having Mosley, not just playing well, but staying healthy is going to be important. Just having him there, stabilizing things, letting everyone else fall into their roles and not have to rotate in and out, fill in for him, move up and down the depth chart. I think that's the most important thing, even more so than his performance. Obviously, you don't want him to be bad, but as long as he's healthy and providing that fundamental and leadership impact, I think that's going to really help the development of the rest of the unit. So Mosley's the biggest X factor. He can be a top 10 guy if he's healthy, but just the intangibles, I think, will help everyone else develop and fall into place. But at the same time, there's a lot of floor here. If you're relying on multiple rookies,
or no floor at all.
Exactly, or no floor at all. You're relying on multiple rookies, a guy in Davis who was not a good player in the for his first 3 years in the league. A guy in Cashman who was a 5th-round pick and struggled the only games he played a couple seasons ago and really struggles to stay healthy. So there is a lot of downside here, but with the linebacker coaches that they have, with the athletic tools of some of these guys, with the way some of these guys fit into the scheme so well, and having a star caliber player at the top in Mosley, there's a lot of upside as well. So this group can fall really anywhere on the spectrum.
Yeah. Every year especially the last decade, it seems like there's dozens of legitimate questions about this team. And every year I talk myself into the optimistic side of things, the positive outcome, what could happen. But this year, all the question marks, I like the potential answers. I really am confident about some of the things that could happen. So I swear this year's different because, you look at the linebacker position, you laid out a bunch of legitimate question marks. And I don't think this is, at least on paper, especially right now, the most talented linebacker group in the world or in the league, I should say. But Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich's experience developing linebackers, and not top, like you said, first-round pick linebackers. These guys have developed young players, day 2 players, day 3 players, undrafted players, and made them into NFL starters. So if any coaching staff can develop talent at this position, it's the one the Jets have. So that lends me to believing in this linebacker unit, especially when you look at Sherwood, Nasirildeen, Cashman, and Davis as well. Mosley, a few months ago, if you asked me, I would have said, I don't have, in my experience as a Jets fan, I don't have much hope that he proves anything. I've seen too many situations like that, most recently being Le'Veon Bell, that the guy is never the same. And it's just another lull Jets moment, a big blunder that the Jets are paying this guy $19 million. But I have to say, just like the point we recently made with Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich, this is the scheme if he's going to do it. He looks good. He seems healthy. Knock on wood, he can stay healthy. But I think this is a system that really benefits him. I think you may see some times where the ball gets thrown over his head, that his athleticism catches up to him a little bit, but he's such a mentally strong player that I think he's going to be huge for this defense, especially, as we said, can stay healthy. I think he's an extension of Ulbrich and Saleh on the field. And Davis, Joe Douglas doesn't overpay guys. And the fact that he overpaid this guy and he was the first Jet signing, I trust Joe Douglas. He hasn't really given me many reasons not to, outside of maybe letting Robbie Anderson walk, who actually at this point wouldn't really be a good fit in this offense, or maybe taking James Morgan, but we don't really know who he is at this point. So Joe Douglas has been, for me, a home run of a GM. A lot of this is on paper, so he could turn from a carrot to a pumpkin anytime now. But at this point in time, I'm a big Joe Douglas fan. He hasn't really given me many reasons not to believe in him. And the fact that him and Saleh and Ulbrich, this all-star linebacker coaching staff, clearly believed in Jarrad Davis, as did a few other teams, to drive up his price, kind of makes me believe that maybe there's something there. So I don't know. I'm optimistic about the unit. Right now, there's no way you can rank this unit as an above average or even an average unit. But I actually think with the coaching staff, you can rank them average. But by the end of the year, after some of the rookie lumps have taken place between Sherwood and Nasirildeen, after some of the youth has been coached out of Cashman, after Mosley's, got his timing back and he's got his, he's not rusty anymore. And Davis is really into the, has adjusted to his new role in a new scheme. I think this is going to be a strong suit in the team. I really believe in this linebacker unit. Maybe it's fool's gold yet again, getting fooled by an optimistic Jets take, but I do believe in this linebacker unit. One of the more positive units I'm looking at this Jets team, but a lot of it hinges, like you said, on CJ Mosley and the rest of the unit's health. That's going to wrap up this positional preview. We'll be back on Monday with our typical CYJ pod, going over some topics. We'll definitely do a mailbag. We'll tweet that over the weekend. So if you want to submit some questions, tweet us at CYJ pod, but we'll put out an official tweet. As I said, you can follow us at CYJ pod. You can follow myself at Ben W. Blessington, Michael at Michael_Nania. Go to JetsXFactor.com, for the best Jets content out there. We appreciate any rate, review, subscribes on iTunes as well. Those help out the podcast tremendously. And outside of that, Michael, I think we're good to go. Anything else in the linebackers?
I guess let's just establish we're going with Jarrad Davis until proven otherwise. Jarrad was my initial looking at the name. That's how it came out for me.
Camilo or Camilo, if he makes the team. For Camilo Eifler is what I've been calling him.
Can we go with Camilo?
But he's listed as it could be Milo, because some people have him listed as just
some places Milo. It's Milo.
So it could be Milo though. Camilo makes more sense. Camilo's kind of weird.
To answer these questions, you got to try to find this is how I figured it out for Patrick Owasso last year. You got to find an interview of them saying their own name, or an official interviewer, some very professional person.
I've been struggling to get.
Not that we're not professional ourselves; we're very professional. But you got to try to find an interview or something. Someone brings it up.
Fair. I've been struggling with Keelan Cole. Or some of the other ones I've messed up with plenty of guys' names. It's not for lack of trying. I really do read their names. It's just, like you said, maybe I should take your advice, look up some interviews. For now, we'll stick with Jarrad Davis. But yeah, we'll be back on Monday with our regular scheduled programming. And then next Thursday, we'll be back most likely with another positional preview, probably head back to the offense side of the ball. Maybe take a look at the receivers, Michael. Sound good? Yeah?
Yeah, receivers sounds fun.
All right, thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you on Monday.
Quickly, down to 6 seconds. Carr going down again. And it's Quentin Williams this time for the Jets.
For the middle in the air, picked off. Brian Poole to the end zone, touchdown. The punter to beat, and the punter brings him down. Braden Mann
saved a touchdown, most likely.
Looks right, fires a bomb down the right sideline again for Mims. What a catch by Denzel Mims.